If you have ever been told that the cause of your depression is some kind of manifestation of low vibration energy, or perhaps that you attracted trauma through your negative thinking, or maybe that setting boundaries is unspiritual. It's not spiritual to set boundaries. If these things have happened to you or you have experienced, then it's likely that you have been experiencing what is called spiritual bypassing. And it's time we talked about what this is all about and how the wellness industry is using enlightenment language, enlightenment words, enlightenment grammar to promote psychological harm. Welcome back to Huddle Psychology, where we get uncomfortably real about the stuff going on in your head. I'm Rahul Nair, and we are here to decode the psychology behind why we do the weird things we actually do. All right, so let's set this thing up for discussion. Wellness culture has a dark side that nobody really wants to talk about. So, beneath all the sage cleansing and manifestation journals, there's a toxic undercurrent that's actually making people's mental health much worse, while at the same time convincing them that they are somehow going through a healing process. It's called spiritual bypassing. Using spiritual concepts, spiritual practices to, in many ways, avoid dealing with psychological wounds, emotional pain, or even personal responsibility. Instead of processing difficult emotions, instead of telling yourself to go through healing process genuinely, you're told instead to raise your vibration somehow. Instead of addressing trauma, you're told to let things go. Instead of setting healthy boundaries, you're told that conflict is low frequency, whatever that means. And what is the result of all this? The result is that people are, in many ways, spiritually gaslighting themselves, avoiding necessary psychological work and developing shame around normal human emotions, all while at the same time being told that they are on a healing journey. Now, this is problematic. And it's problematic because dealing with emotions, dealing with your troubles, always involves psychological work from our side. And bypassing them can lead to significant psychological harm. So, what is the core concept here that I'm trying to talk about? Spiritual bypassing was first coined by a psychologist called John Wellwood in the 1980s. It's basically defined as the tendency to use spiritual ideas, spiritual concepts, and practices to somehow sidestep psychological, emotional, or developmental work, sidestepping the important stuff. Essentially, it's using spirituality as a sophisticated form of denial. That's what it essentially is. So here's how it is likely to show up in modern wellness culture, and perhaps it has shown up in your life too. So, number one, toxic positivity disguised as enlightenment. So, what do I mean by that? You're told that negative emotions are low vibration, or that you're choosing to be sad for some reason. This creates essentially shame around normal human emotions and experiences, like, for example, grief, anger, or fear, for example. Real spiritual traditions, on the other hand, honest spiritual traditions, on the other hand, understand that all emotions are all emotions are important parts of the human experience, and they serve important functions. But in spiritual bypassing, you're told that all of these essential human emotions are to be bypassed through various kinds of spiritual practices. Number two, victim blaming through manifestation logic. The idea that you attract you attract everything that happens to you sounds empowering for a short while. But it's actually, when you come to think of it, is victim blaming dressed up as spiritual wisdom. That's what it essentially is. It suggests that people who experience trauma, people who experience illness or hardship, for that matter, somehow choose, or they created these experiences through their thoughts and make them a reality through their thoughts or through their energy. So that's another way how spiritual bypassing can happen or shows up in your life through this whole manifestation logic. Thirdly, premature forgiveness. Premature forgiveness and letting go idea. Now, you're pressured to forgive, say, for example, abusers and release your anger, or simply let go of your pain before you've had the chance to actually process it. And that's dangerous. This bypasses the necessary and important stages of grief, and it bypasses important stages of healing. Real forgiveness, I'm not saying forgiveness is not important. I'm not saying one should harbor grudge for the longest period. Real forgiveness comes after acknowledgement of what has happened, not instead of it. And there is a difference between that. And lastly, emotional spiritual perfectionism. And by that, I mean the pressure to always be grateful. While gratitude is a fantastic and an important thing, but to be always grateful, there is a pressure to be always grateful, to be positive or high vibe. And that pressure creates what we can call spiritual ego, that's just as toxic as your regular ego. You start performing enlightenment instead of actually growing as a human being. So that's another way spiritual bypassing can show up in your life. So essentially, the psychology behind this is actually quite important to understand. The psychology behind this is that emotions exist for evolutionary purposes. They exist for evolutionary reasons. Fear keeps us safe. Anger motivates us to defend our boundaries. That's what anger is. Therefore, sadness helps us process loss. For example, when you spiritually bypass these emotions, you don't transcend them at all. Instead, you just push them underground, where they create more problems than solve anything. The true work, the real, true spiritual growth actually requires psychological maturity. Actually, I am from the school of thought where we see psychology and spirituality to be two sides of the same coin. And that is why my practice is essentially about spreading psychological, philosophical, and spiritual literacy, because there is a connecting thread between these three disciplines. So, real spiritual growth requires psychological maturity and the other way around as well, not the avoidance of psychological work. Most authentic and real spiritual traditions, you will see if you study them, that they emphasize the importance of dealing with your human psychology as part of the growth, the spiritual growth that one is yearning towards. And this I have explored in my other blog. The link which is below is called the neovedantist.com, where I have begun a comparative study between Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, and modern psychological science, Western philosophy, and also doing a comparative theological study, including three traditions: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the three Abrahamic religions, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. And if you go and read those rather long form articles, you will see there are common threads. Genuine spiritual traditions require psychological work, and you will see that there is a common thread between spirituality and psychology. So, when it comes to dealing with your human psychology, when it comes to authentic spiritual traditions, your authentic growth requires you to understand human emotions and all that makes you human, the emotions and the feelings that one has, as opposed to somehow bypassing them. So, how do you distinguish between spiritual growth and spiritual bypassing? Three reality checks here that I can really pinpoint you towards. Number one is the emotion integration test. And by that, I mean healthy spirituality helps you feel your emotions more fully. It helps you process them more skillfully and not avoid them entirely. So it's about understanding them more properly as opposed to avoiding them. If your spiritual practices are somehow making you feel guilty about the normal human emotions that you're likely to feel, then, or perhaps you're constantly trying to transcend feelings rather than understand them, then be warned that it's a signal that there's bypassing that is actually happening. Another reality check is what I call the responsibility balance check. Genuine spirituality involves taking responsibility. Responsibility for your responses, for your choices, while recognizing that you're not responsible for everything that happens to you. You are responsible for your choices, but perhaps not responsible for everything that happens to you. If your spiritual beliefs make you feel guilty, again, about circumstances beyond your control, or if they excuse you from taking important actions to improve your life, then that's bypassing again. Thirdly, what I call the growth versus comfort assessment. Real spiritual work is often uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable because it requires facing parts of yourself you'd rather avoid sometimes, or maybe most of the times. If your spiritual practice primarily makes you feel good about yourself without challenging you to grow or change some difficult patterns in your life, it might be sophisticated self soothing essentially. And that is another form of bypassing rather than genuine spiritual development. Look, ultimately, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with spiritual practices, positive thinking, or focusing on gratitude. There's nothing wrong in doing that. The problem is when these become ways to avoid dealing with proper psychological issues, legitimate psychological issues that require professional help, difficult conversations, and uncomfortable emotions. So, here's what healthier or healthy spiritual psychological integration might look like. Using meditation, for example, to become more aware of your emotional patterns, not to escape them, but to become more aware of them. Using gratitude to appreciate what you have while still working to improve what needs changing. And then perhaps using forgiveness as the end result of a healing process, not as a way to skip the process entirely. These are some healthy ways where spiritual and psychological insights can come together to help us. So, having said all this, here's your homework for this week. Notice if you use spiritual ideas, concepts to avoid difficult emotions or situations. Do you tell yourself to just be grateful when you're legitimately upset about something? Do you feel guilty about having normal human emotions because they are somehow low vibration? Do you feel guilty about these things? Are you avoiding necessary psychological work because you think you should be able to somehow spiritually transcend them, avoid your problems? Remember always that true spirituality and true spiritual growth includes psychological well-being and psychological health, not instead of it. You can meditate and also go to therapy. You can practice gratitude and also set boundaries. You can work on raising your vibration if that's your thing, and also take antidepressants if you need them. That is something that is worth remembering. So, that is what spiritual bypassing was all about. I hope that was useful to you and brought to you some new ideas and concepts about how you bypass how you may be unconsciously, unknowingly bypassing your emotions using spiritual concepts. Next week, we are kind of diving into your nervous system. We dive into your nervous system's window of tolerance, why you actually shut down or explode under duress, under stress, and how to find the sweet spot where you can actually handle life's challenges without falling apart. But that's next week. Again, coming back to this week's topic of spiritual bypassing, drop me some comments. Have you experienced spiritual bypassing, either from yourself or from others? How do you balance spiritual practices with psychological realities? Let's keep this conversation as nuanced as possible. And as always, if you want to dig deeper, please do visit our blog, huddlepsychology.substack.com, for the full research breakdown on many of the topics that we are talking about. And if you need to talk about any of these things one on one, hit me up at rahul@huddlepsychology.com. So, until next time, keep huddling, keep growing. Ciao for now.